For today's lesson, we are going to be looking at the plasma membrane, and this comes from the next two subtopics on membrane structure and membrane transport. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe and draw the structure of the plasma membrane, and you should be able to discuss ways in which its structure determines its function. So this is looking at one specific assessment statement, 1.3.S1 drawing of the fluid mosaic model. However, by the end of the lesson, you will have increased your background knowledge on a variety of the other assessment statements from topics 1.3 and 1.4. So the agenda for today, you should already have viewed the video. I'm going to be going through some information for you that will help you with doing the 1.3 cell membrane and transport illustrations assignment. Then you and a partner will do a peer review of each other's illustration, and there will be an exit ticket on Canvas. From our last unit of study, you should be able to answer this question at this point in time. The function of the plasma membrane has a variety of functions, but one of those is to regulate what goes in and out of the cell. And we're going to be looking today at how its structure allows it to carry out its function. We've looked at this statement before: health and well-being depend on the relationship between structure and function, and you're going to see that that is extremely evident in this particular unit. And because of that, we'll be looking at the next two subtopics together, because you cannot separate structure from function. So the first part of your transport membrane and transport illustrations assignment is to draw a picture, a labeled picture of the cell membrane, and I've given you some different things that you need to include there. So you'll want to draw these things and label them, and then you need to annotate each structure with its function. So what does it specifically do for the cell membrane? This is the top portion of the big sheet of paper that you were given in class that you'll be working on. Just a reminder that on Canvas there are a whole bunch of resources available for you. If you click on modules and then go to topic 1.3 section, you'll find a variety of different illustrations and instructions that I've put on there for you. That includes a link to a page from the online course companion that gives you some fairly specific directions and an example of how you could draw your picture. We've also had students that have used this picture from the Campbell textbook and tried to recreate a little bit more of a three-dimensional look for the plasma membrane. Either of those is fine. It's up to you as long as you include all of the required structures. So before you get to work illustrating, I want to talk just a little bit about the different structures that you find within the plasma membrane. It is referred to as a fluid mosaic model. Mosaic because it has so many different components, and fluid because the components move and interact, so it's not stationary, and the components within the membrane actually slide back and forth around each other to some extent. The membrane is made up of three basic structures. The first are phospholipids. Phospholipids are molecules that have what's called a polar or hydrophilic head. Hydrophilic means water-loving, polar means it has an uneven distribution of charge within the molecules. And then it has two fatty acid tails. Fats, as you know, are not soluble in water, so these are nonpolar or hydrophobic water-hating molecules. These are positioned very, very closely together, and they actually form a bilayer, which you'll see here shortly. Embedded within the phospholipids, we find cholesterol. This is a molecule that gets a really bad name in terms of our diet, but it's actually integral to membrane function. And so here you can see the bilayer of the phospholipids, and embedded within that you can see some cholesterol molecules. And then embedded within all of that we have proteins. And we'll take a look at some of the different types of proteins, but you can see on this picture the purple protein is what we call an integral protein because it completely penetrates through the bilayer. The brown protein there is what we would call a peripheral protein because it does not completely penetrate through the bilayer and would have a different function. So the phospholipids, as I said, are a bilayer of molecules, and the polar heads always point outward and the nonpolar tails always point inward. And so you can see several different representations of what these molecules look like. This is referred to as an amphipathetic molecule because of the two different parts, the polar region and the nonpolar region. As you know, the polar regions are going to orient outwards because they are going to be in contact with water. The nonpolar fatty acid tails will point towards the inwards towards each other, so they are somewhat insulated from the watery cytoplasm of the cell and the watery extracellular space around the outside of the cell. Cholesterol is present, and the main job of cholesterol is that it allows the membrane to function at a much wider range of temperatures than if it were not present. It also has an interesting characteristics in that it makes the membrane a little bit more fluid than it would be without it, but it doesn't make it completely fluid. It actually limits the fluidity to some extent as well. Proteins are embedded in the phospholipids in a variety of different places, and as I said earlier, there are two main types: integral, which pass all the way through, as you can see by the purple one here, and you should be able to guess by looking at that structure that that function is going to be to allow molecules to travel across the membrane, either into the cell or out of the cell. Peripheral proteins are proteins like the brown one that does not penetrate the entire way through the cell layers. Sometimes they're to the inside, sometimes they're to the outside of the membrane, and you'll see that they have a different type of function than transport. In fact, there are 6 different types of proteins that can be found embedded in the plasma membrane, and so they serve 6 different functions. You will need to know all 6 of these different functions, and so today's activity is going to help you to start learning those different functions. I have found 2 different mnemonic devices that you could use to help you in memorizing these functions. The first one is Tracy, and the second one is Jet Rat. After you do some work with these today, you'll probably feel like one or the other of those mnemonic devices works better for you, but I would encourage you to pick one in helping you to memorize these different functions. Notice also there's some nice pictures here that you might want to make use of as you're doing your illustrations. So the second part of your illustrations assignment is to actually illustrate all 6 of those different protein functions and then describe each function in your own words. So I'm going to show an example to you of different ways in which you could represent these as pictures. The point of the pictures is to help you remember the functions. So draw a type of picture that will help you remember that function. So I'm going to do cell-to-cell communication. And so one way that you could draw this picture is to draw the actual thing. So here you see on my picture 2 different cells, one cell here, one cell here. This would be the inside of the top cell, this was the inside of the bottom, this is intracellular space. These 2 cells are communicating with each other via a glycoprotein extension from this protein that's embedded in the cell membrane. So that would be a way to draw the actual structure. You could draw an example. This is an example from the nervous system where one nerve cell is communicating with the other nerve cell by sending a neurotransmitter molecule across the gap between the 2 cells. You could represent the idea with graphics. Here we have 2 different cells talking to each other via cell phones. You could draw a symbol that helps you to remember that. So this would be a cell phone as a symbol of cell-to-cell communication. Though that picture is so old it's hard to even recognize it as a cell phone anymore. Or finally, if you want to be really creative, you could dramatize by using cartoon bubbles. So we have 2 amoeba cells here talking to each other, communicating with each other. So those are a variety of different ways in which you could represent the different cell membrane functions. Again, remember the point is to help you remember the functions. So draw something that is helpful to you and then write about the function in your own words to help you remember it. The last part of the membrane and transport illustrations assignment is to draw the actual forms of transport that the cell membrane allows us to do. So let's think back. What are the different ways in which substances move in and out of a cell? These different processes should be familiar to you from past science classes. Our goal for today is to refresh our memories on those and to build our background knowledge. So if we take a look at this picture, we can see that there are 2 basic categories of transport. We have passive transport and we have active transport. And if you look carefully at these pictures, you can see 2 major differences between our large types here. If we look down at active transport, we see ATP here, which is our energy molecule. We don't see ATP up in the forms of passive transport. So one conclusion we should be able to draw is that active transport requires energy from the cell. I like to remember the A's go together. Active transport requires ATP, requires energy. Passive transport does not. If we look even more carefully at these diagrams, we can see in both of the forms of passive transport up here, the molecules are moving from outside in, and they are moving from an area where there's more molecules to an area where there's less. So we say they are moving from a high concentration to a low concentration, or they are moving with the concentration gradient. If you look at our picture of active transport, you can see that the molecules are also moving into the cell, But this time they're moving from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. So they are moving against the concentration gradient, which is why this type of transport requires energy from the cell to do. Molecules will naturally flow from high to low concentrations. They will not naturally flow from low to high concentrations. So just to summarize the two basic types of cellular transport, we have passive transport, which requires no cellular energy, no ATP, moves with the concentration gradient, and the varieties are diffusion, either simple and facilitated, and osmosis. Active transport does require cellular energy in the form of ATP. Molecules move against the concentration gradient, and we have carrier transport, which involves pumps, some of which you drew when you were looking at membrane protein functions, and bulk transport, which we refer to as endocytosis and exocytosis. So that kind of summarizes your assignment for today and what you should be working on. So for the remainder of the period until we come back together, you should work on the 1.3 cell membrane and transport illustrations assignment. Reminder of features that make good diagrams. Make sure that you use good use of space. You have clear, strong lines. Your lines are straight. You're using a straight edge for those. Your labels are clearly written. The lines touch the labeled structure. There's not unnecessary shading or coloring. Your diagram is done neatly to the best of your ability, and so on. Okay, so you can go back and review this video or the corresponding PowerPoint as you're working through this assignment. And your goal by the end of this is to have a better understanding of membrane structure and then how that membrane structure impacts membrane function.